History remembers Gaius Julius Caesar as an untouchable titan, a military deity who crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, and bent the Roman Republic to his absolute will through sheer, unadulterated genius. We are taught that his veterans were invincible machine-like killers, and that his legendary luck, his fortuna, never failed him. But history textbooks are written by the victors, and they routinely cover up the most terrifying, desperate 48 hours of Caesar's life. 4 years before his assassination on the Ides of March, Julius Caesar stood in the freezing mud of Dyrrhachium, completely outmaneuvered, isolated, and staring directly into the abyss of absolute military annihilation. For the first time in his career, his hand-picked, hardened legions did not march forward like a flawless war machine. They panicked, they broke, and they ran for their lives like a terrified mob, trampling Caesar himself into the dirt as they fled. This is not a story of a glorious Roman triumph. This is a forensic reconstruction of a forgotten logistical nightmare. It is a psychological case study of what happens when a legendary commander's absolute arrogance blinds him to a catastrophic structural flaw, and how a single, high-stakes military gamble nearly ended the Western world before it even began. Over the next hour, we will strip away the polished marble myth of the Roman Empire and expose the gritty, horrific reality of the campaign that almost broke Julius Caesar. We will uncover the toxic gray root bread that horrified the Roman elite, the brutal amphibious betrayal that shattered a 15-mile wall of dirt, and the blind, visceral violence of a single eyeless centurion who held off an entire army alone. Today, we look behind the propaganda, because before Julius Caesar could rule Rome, he had to survive a disaster that his own soldiers believed was a curse from the gods. The trap at the edge of the world. To understand the absolute insanity of what happened at Dyrrhachium, you have to look at how completely Julius Caesar had managed to screw himself over before the fighting even started. Imagine you are the greatest military mind of your generation. You just spent a decade conquering Gaul, you're a household name, and you decide it's time to take over Rome. You chase your arch-rival, Pompey the Great, across the sea to modern-day Albania. You land your legions on the beach, ready for a decisive, glorious showdown. And then, you realize you forgot the food. Seriously, Caesar's logistics were a complete, unmitigated catastrophe. And to understand why, you have to look at his opponent. Pompey wasn't just some random politician. He was a legendary naval commander who had literally cleared the entire Mediterranean of pirates a few decades prior. Pompey controlled the ocean. He had a massive fleet of over 500 warships patrolling the Adriatic Sea, led in part by his own ruthless son, Gnaeus Pompeius. This naval blockade was so airtight, it felt like a psychological horror movie for Caesar's men. Caesar had rushed across the sea with only half his army, leaving his second-in-command, Mark Antony, stranded back in Italy with the rest of the troops. Every time Antony tried to sail over with reinforcements and grain, Pompey's warships would materialize out of the coastal fog like ghosts, ramming the transport ships, setting them on fire, and leaving Caesar's soldiers to drown in the freezing dark. In one horrific skirmish, Pompey's fleet cornered 2 of Caesar's transport ships near the rocky shallows. One ship, filled with raw, terrified recruits, surrendered immediately. Pompey's men lined them up on the deck and butchered every single one of them to send message. The other ship was packed with Caesar's veteran legionaries. Instead of surrendering, they intentionally ran their own ship aground, waded onto a barren, rocky island in the pitch black, and fought off hundreds of Pompey's marines using nothing but stones and broken swords until they were rescued. Because of this brutal blockade, Caesar's men were trapped on a narrow strip of rocky, barren coastline. Pompey's army was living like kings, imported Egyptian grain, fresh mountain water, fine Spanish wine, the works. Caesar's men were starving. They were caked in sweat, drinking stagnant water from muddy puddles infected with horse disease, and their ribs were starting to show. It got so bad that the horses and pack animals were dying by the thousands. To keep his remaining cavalry mounts from starving to death, Caesar literally had to order his men to scrape toxic seaweed off the ocean rocks, wash it in fresh water over and over again to get the salt out, and force-feed the slimy green sludge to the horses just to keep their organs from failing. Now, any normal general in this position would have swallowed his pride and retreated. But Caesar didn't do normal. In fact, right in the middle of this starvation crisis, Caesar suffered a minor psychological break and attempted one of the most reckless, unhinged suicide missions in military history. One night, during a catastrophic winter hurricane, Caesar looked out at the raging ocean. He was so frustrated that Mark Antony hadn't crossed over with the rest of his army that he decided he would go get them himself. He pulled on a dirty, ragged cloak, disguised himself as a low-born slave, and walked down to the docks alone. He found a tiny, three-oared fishing boat and paid the terrified local captain a fortune in gold to row him out into the middle of the storm, directly through Pompey's naval patrol lines. The storm was apocalyptic. Waves the size of multi-story buildings were crashing over the tiny wooden hull. The captain, freezing and blinded by the rain, completely panicked and ordered the crew to turn back around before they capsized. At that exact moment, Caesar stepped forward, threw off his slave cloak, grabbed the captain by the throat, and roared over the thunder. "Fear nothing, Manuel. You carry Caesar and his fortune." He literally tried to fight a hurricane using nothing but his own massive ego. The ocean obviously did not care who Caesar was. A massive wave slammed into the boat, nearly snapping the oars and flooding the deck. Realizing that even his mythical luck couldn't stop physics, Caesar was forced to let the crew row back to shore, caked in salt water and completely humiliated. He walked back to his tent in the dead of night, realizing no help was coming. He was entirely on his own. So, what do you do when your army is starving, your suicide mission fails, and you're backed against the sea by a force that completely outmatches you? If you're Caesar, you look at the enemy army and you decide to do something so wildly unprecedented it sounds like a glitch in a strategy game. You decide to build a wall around them. Think about the sheer, delusional audacity of this. Caesar ordered his starving, exhausted legions to build a massive, unbroken 15-mile ring of dirt fortifications, wooden stakes, and deep trenches to completely blockade Pompey's army against the coast. It's like a broke guy trying to foreclose on a billionaire's mansion. Pompey had more troops, better supplies, and an open ocean behind him. Yet Caesar was acting like he was the one holding all the cards. This wasn't neat, orderly engineering. It was a grueling, industrial nightmare. Caesar's men were working double shifts in the pouring rain, caked in thick, gray mud. Pompey's scouts were constantly probing the lines, launching sudden, violent night raids just to disrupt the digging. Pompey's archers would hide in the tree lines, raining down thousands of arrows on the working parties. It got so intense that Caesar's men had to invent makeshift armor out of heavy layers of garment and stitched leather just to avoid being turned into pincushions while they held their shovels. The air was constantly filled with the sound of snapping wood, screaming men, and the dull, repetitive thud of iron tools hitting rocky soil. And right here, in the middle of this absolute meat grinder, we get one of the most bizarre psychological mind games in ancient military history. As the weeks dragged on into months, Caesar's men completely ran out of standard grain. To keep from starving, the soldiers started foraging in the surrounding marshes, digging past the mud. They discovered a wild, bitter marsh tuber called chara. It was a foul, fibrous root that looked completely toxic. But the legionaries got creative. They pounded the root into a paste, mixed it with whatever milk they could scrounge from dying cows, and baked it into hard, ugly, gray loaves of substitute bread. It tasted like dirt and leather, but it kept them alive. Now, if you're a normal soldier, you hide your shameful, disgusting root bread from the enemy. But Caesar's veterans were a completely different breed of unhinged. Pompey's elite, wealthy aristocratic troops used to line up on their clean, dry ramparts just to mock Caesar's men. They would look down into the muddy trenches and shout insults, calling them starving beggars, dogs, and hobos who were too poor to feed themselves. Caesar's men tolerated it for a while. Then, they decided to respond. During a sudden lull in the rain, a group of caked-in-mud legionaries walked right up to the edge of Pompey's trenches. Pompey's men raised their shields, expecting a volley of javelins. But Caesar's men didn't draw their weapons. Instead, they reached into their filthy tunics, pulled out these heavy, stone-hard loaves of gray chara root bread, and aggressively hurled them directly into the faces of Pompey's wealthy soldiers. They started screaming taunts over the wall, yelling that they would eat the literal dirt of the earth and graze like wild cattle before they ever let Pompey win. A few of these gray, mysterious loaves were picked up by Pompey's officers and brought directly to his grand command tent. Pompey sat at his desk, surrounded by clean maps and fine wine, and stared at this toxic-looking mass of root bread. He pressed his finger into it. It was rock hard. It looked like something an animal would reject. And according to ancient writers, Pompey genuinely paled. He looked up at his staff officers, completely horrified, and muttered a line that perfectly sums up the psychological terror Caesar's men inflicted. "I'm fighting wild beasts, not men." Pompey was a traditional, old-school Roman general. He understood tactics, logistics, and numbers. But he did not know how to handle an army of fanatical masochists who were perfectly willing to eat poisonous marsh roots just for the privilege of stabbing him in the chest. Pompey was so terrified of the psychological damage this bread would do to his own soft, well-fed troops that he ordered the loaves to be burned and buried immediately, forbidding anyone in the camp from ever speaking of them again. For a brief moment, Caesar's crazy psychological warfare had worked. The wall was holding, Pompey was sweating, and Caesar's legendary luck seemed untouchable. He had successfully trapped the largest army in the Roman world inside a 15-mile cage of dirt. But Caesar had made a fatal mistake. In his absolute arrogance, he assumed his wall was a flawless masterpiece. He was so busy looking at Pompey's front lines that he completely missed a glaring, catastrophic structural blind spot at the extreme southern end of his fortifications where the dirt wall met the crashing waves of the sea. And unfortunately for Caesar, two of his closest, most trusted officers had just noticed it too. The anatomy of a blind spot. If you want to make God laugh, show him a military fortification built by an arrogant genius. Caesar was entirely convinced his 15-mile wall of dirt, stakes, and trenches was an inescapable cage. He genuinely believed Pompey was a cornered rat who would eventually starve or surrender. But a 15-mile wall is only as strong as its weakest link. And Caesar's link wasn't just weak, it was completely unfinished. To understand where Caesar blew it, you have to picture the geography. The southern tip of Caesar's massive fortification wall ran down a steep ridge and terminated right at the edge of the Adriatic Sea. Caesar knew that if Pompey's men could just wade around the end of the wall through the surf, the whole blockade would collapse. So, he ordered his men to build a second parallel wall, a short distance behind the first one, creating a protected trench. But here's the catch. Caesar's legions ran out of time. They dug the trenches, they threw up the earthworks, but they never actually finished the transverse wall connecting the two parallel lines at the water's edge. It was like building a state-of-the-art security fence, but leaving the back gate wide open because you ran out of zip ties. If an enemy landed ships between those two unfinished walls, they could march straight into the rear of Caesar's camp without facing a single defensive stake. Now, Caesar wasn't completely stupid. He knew it was unfinished, but he assumed that since Pompey's camp was miles away, There was no way the enemy could see this tiny structural flaw through the dense coastal fog and rocky terrain. It was a secret until Caesar's own inner circle decided to cash in. Enter Rubicon and Egas. These two brothers weren't just random grunt soldiers. They were high-ranking nobles from the Allobroges tribe in Gaul. They were brilliant cavalry commanders whom Caesar had personally chosen, showered with wealth, and trusted with his most sensitive tactical secrets. Caesar loved these guys. He had given them seats on the local senate back in Gaul and handed them massive sums of gold. But wealth has a funny way of making people think they are untouchable. Back in the winter camp, Rubicon and Egas started acting like warlords. They stole the payroll meant for their own foreign cavalry troops, falsified horse counts to pocket extra rations, and privately executed anyone who complained about it. When the cheating got too loud to ignore, the regular soldiers marched straight to Caesar's tent and exposed the fraud. Now, normally, Caesar would have had these guys executed on the spot to maintain discipline. But remember, Caesar was a politician. He didn't want to anger the powerful Gallic tribes back home while he was in the middle of a civil war. So, he pulled the two brothers into a private room, gave them a stern, humiliating lecture, and told them to behave themselves. He thought he was being a merciful, pragmatic leader. He was actually being an idiot. Humiliated, terrified that their careers were over, and realizing Caesar's mercy was a sign of desperation, Rubicon and Egas decided to jump ship before it sank. They waited for the dead of night, stole a massive cache of gold from the camp treasury, and rode their horses straight across the lines to Pompey's camp. They didn't just defect, they handed Pompey the ultimate cheat code for the war. They sat in Pompey's command tent and gave him a forensic, step-by-step breakdown of Caesar's entire setup. They told him exactly how many men were sick, the precise hour of the guard shifts, and most importantly, they pointed directly at the map to the unfinished southern wall by the sea. Pompey couldn't believe his luck. He didn't waste a single hour. He immediately drafted a highly complex, multi-pronged amphibious assault designed to exploit that exact blind spot. At 3 o'clock in the morning, under the cover of a freezing, pitch-black coastal fog, Pompey launched his trap. He split his army into two massive strike forces. The first force marched silently down the coast on foot. The second force, thousands of light infantry, archers, and specialized marine commandos, boarded a fleet of merchant ships and small rowboats, gliding silently through the dark water. Their target was the 9th Legion, who were tasked with guarding that exact southern sector. Now, the 9th Legion were hardened veterans, but they were exhausted, shivering from the damp ocean air, and completely unprepared for what was coming. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to break over the cliffs, the lookouts on the wall heard a bizarre, rhythmic splashing sound out in the water. Suddenly, the fog parted. Thousands of Pompey's Marines slammed their boats into the shallows, throwing scaling ladders directly against the unfinished dirt ramparts. Simultaneously, the land force charged out of the tree line, screaming their war cries and throwing javelins. It was an absolute slaughter. Pompey's archers stayed out in the boats, raining thousands of arrows onto the exposed, half-naked legionaries who were rushing out their tents. The Roman writer Suetonius notes that the arrow fire was so dense it felt like a physical wall of iron falling from the sky. Right in the middle of this bloody chaos, an ancient omen occurred that sent a wave of pure, superstitious terror through Caesar's men. The standard-bearer of the 9th Legion, the man responsible for carrying the sacred silver eagle that represented the soul of the entire legion, was mortally wounded by an arrow to the throat. As he lay dying in the mud, surrounded by the screaming, retreating mob, he didn't try to save his own life. Instead, he dragged his bleeding body toward a group of fleeing cavalrymen. With his final breath, he roared a terrifying curse through the blood in his mouth. "Take this eagle. I have defended it with my life for decades, and I will not let it be disgraced in death. If you lose it, the gods will curse Caesar's name forever. He thrust the heavy silver pole into the hands of a terrified rider and collapsed into the dirt. In ancient Rome, losing an eagle was the ultimate cosmic disgrace. It meant the gods had actively abandoned you. To the superstitious soldiers of the Ninth, watching their sacred standard get passed around in the mud while thousands of enemies poured through the unfinished wall wasn't just a tactical failure. It felt like a divine eviction notice. The line completely snapped. The veterans of the Ninth Legion, men who had conquered savage tribes across Europe without flinching, threw down their weapons, turned their backs to the enemy, and began a frantic, panicked stampede up the ridge. The secret gate was open. Pompey's army was flooding into the rear of the lines, and Caesar's invincible empire was unraveling in real time. The day the veterans panicked. When a military line snaps, it doesn't just break, it dissolves like wet paper. By the time Julius Caesar received word of the disaster at the southern wall, the entire Ninth Legion wasn't just retreating. They were actively running for their lives. The carefully constructed 15-mile cage of earthworks had transformed into a giant, claustrophobic death trap. This is the absolute lowest point of Caesar's military career. The myth of his untouchable veterans, the men who had spent 10 years chewing through Germanic hordes and Gallic rebellions without breaking a sweat, vanished in a single morning. Caesar, who was stationed at a central camp miles away, immediately jumped onto his horse. He didn't wait to draw up a massive strategic counteroffensive. He didn't wait for his staff officers to analyze the maps. He just grabbed his signature bright red general's cloak, called up his personal bodyguard, and rode his horse at a full gallop directly into the bottleneck where the panic was happening. As he got closer to the ridge, the scene was pure, unadulterated horror. The air was thick with the smell of copper, burning tents, and the suffocating dust kicked up by thousands of boots. The road was entirely blocked by a chaotic stampede of his own soldiers. Men were dropping their heavy wooden shields, tossing aside their javelins, and knocking each other over into the trenches just to move faster. They weren't looking back. They were completely blinded by a raw, primal animal terror. Now, if you're a normal general, you stand behind the lines and try to yell orders through a trumpet. But Caesar's entire leadership style was based on toxic masculinity and absolute theatrical dominance. He genuinely believed his men loved him so much that his mere presence could stop a rout. He was dead wrong. Caesar leaped off his horse and threw himself right into the middle of the narrow dirt path, putting his own body directly in the way of the stampede. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, calling his men by name, reminding them of their past glories in Gaul. He began physically grabbing fleeing soldiers by the shoulders, spinning them around, and pointing back toward the enemy, roaring, "The enemy is that way. Turn around and fight." But the psychological damage was already done. The soldiers weren't listening to their god king anymore. They were looking past him at the massive wave of Pompey's elite infantry pouring over the ridge. Right here, we get one of the most terrifying, intimate anecdotes ever recorded about Caesar. As Caesar was standing in the mud, a massive, burly veteran standard-bearer came charging down the path, carrying a lesser cohort banner. He was running so fast his eyes were rolled back in his head. Caesar stepped directly into his path, grabbed the man by the collar of his armor, and physically yanked him to a halt through sheer adrenaline. Caesar shouted, "Hold the standard! Turn back!" The standard-bearer didn't drop to his knees. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, blinded by pure, unhinged survival panic, the soldier went completely insane. He flipped the heavy, iron-tipped standard upside down in his hands, leveled the spear point directly at Caesar's chest, and lunged forward with full intent to murder his own commander just to get him out of the way. Think about the absolute madness of that moment. The master of the Roman world was about to be shish kebab by his own hand-picked elite soldier in a muddy ditch in Albania. Before the iron tip could pierce Caesar's throat, his personal bodyguard, a massive, heavily armored Germanic warrior, stepped into the blind spot. The bodyguard didn't try to tackle the soldier or reason with him. He drew his gladius in a fraction of a second and cleanly severed the standard-bearer's arm at the elbow. The silver banner clattered into the mud, still gripped by a detached, bleeding hand, and the soldier collapsed screaming into the dirt as the rest of the mob sprinted over his body. Caesar was pulled back by his officers, completely stunned. For the first time in his life, his absolute authority had failed. His men didn't respect him. They were more afraid of Pompey's swords than they were of his anger. Realizing that trying to stop the stampede was a suicide mission, Caesar was forced to join the retreat. He had to run with the mob, covered in the mud and blood of his own men, abandoning his camps, his equipment, and his pride. By midday, the rout had pushed Caesar's surviving forces all the way back into an old, abandoned fortification called the Left Camp. Thousands of his men were packed inside the earthworks like sardines, gasping for air, bleeding, and weeping. There was zero military discipline left. Officers had lost their units, supplies were scattered, and the entire army was backed against a steep ravine. If Pompey's forces pressed the attack into the camp right now, there was nowhere left to run. The civil war would end in a matter of minutes. Caesar's head would be put on a spike, and the Roman Republic would stand forever. Caesar retreated to his personal tent, completely alone. Outside, he could hear the groans of the dying and the frantic prayers of soldiers who believed they were cursed. He sat at his camp table, staring at his hands, waiting for the sound of Pompey's battering rams to hit the gate. He knew his legendary Fortuna had finally run out. But out on the battlefield, looking down at the defenseless, trapped remnants of Caesar's army, Pompey the Great did something that completely defied military logic. He raised his hand, signaled his trumpeters, and ordered his entire army to halt and sound a retreat. Pompey's fatal hesitation. To understand why Julius Caesar didn't die in the mud of Dyrrhachium, you have to look away from the battlefield and step inside the grand command tent of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Outside, the trumpets were sounding the retreat. Caesar's men, packed like terrified animals inside the ditches of the left camp, couldn't believe their ears. They had been bracing for the final, bloody blow, but instead, Pompey's legions were dropping back into defensive formations. Caesar himself supposedly stood on the ramparts, caked in dirt, staring across the smoking field in absolute disbelief. He later wrote a line in his personal memoirs that perfectly captures the sheer absurdity of that afternoon. Today the victory belonged to the enemy. If only they had a commander who knew how to win. So, why did the man nicknamed the Teenage Butcher by his enemies, the most celebrated general in Rome, suddenly freeze at the exact moment of his ultimate triumph? If you open a standard dry history textbook, it will tell you that Pompey was simply a cautious, old-school tactician who suspected Caesar was setting a trap. They argue that because Caesar was famous for his dirty tricks, hidden trenches, and sudden counter-ambushes, Pompey feared that the routing army was actually baiting him into a bottleneck. But that is a surface-level explanation. The real reason Pompey stopped goes much deeper, revealing the profound, systemic rot inside the Roman Republic's high command. You see, Pompey wasn't just leading an army. He was leading an entourage of high society politicians. Because he had positioned himself as the defender of the traditional Roman Senate against the rebel Caesar, his camp was absolutely crawling with hundreds of elite Roman senators, wealthy aristocrats, and arrogant young patricians who had fled Rome. These men weren't soldiers. They were billionaire oligarchs who wore bleached white tunics into the mud, brought their personal household slaves to carry their armor, and spent their evenings drinking expensive imported wine while complaining about the lack of fresh oysters at the front lines. To these aristocratic elites, the war was already over. For weeks, Pompey's camp had devolved into a toxic, high-stakes game of political musical chairs. Instead of focusing on logistics or training the troops, the senators spent every single day aggressively arguing over who would get to confiscate Caesar's massive properties once he was executed. They drew up lists of Caesar's friends and allies who would be stripped of their wealth, and they openly fought over who would inherit Caesar's prestigious title of Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest of Rome. The ancient writer Plutarch notes that the camp felt less like a military headquarters and more like a corrupt political convention. Domitius Ahenobarbus, a bitter enemy of Caesar, was locked in a fierce, multi-day screaming match with another senator over who would get to rent out Caesar's luxurious mansion on the Palatine Hill. They were dividing up the skin of the lion before the lion was even dead. And this insufferable arrogance completely paralyzed Pompey's authority. Pompey was a brilliant military mind, but he was also a man deeply insecure about his political status. He desperately wanted the approval of these old-money Roman elites. Every single time he tried to make a strategic decision, a committee of wealthy politicians would pull him aside to lecture him. They mocked his caution, openly calling him a slow, lazy coward. Some of the younger, snobbish senators even started calling him Agamemnon and the King of Kings behind his back, implying that he was intentionally dragging out the civil war just so he could keep his supreme military command and act like a dictator. When Caesar's line broke at dawn, Pompey didn't see a tactical opening. He saw a massive, terrifying political risk. He looked at the chaotic bottleneck at the southern wall, and his mind immediately started racing. If he ordered a full, aggressive charge into the camp, his troops would inevitably mix with the routing enemy in a brutal, unpredictable melee. In a frantic, close-quarters infantry meat grinder, anything could happen. If a stray javelin happened to strike down one of the prominent senators who had foolishly ridden out to watch the slaughter, Pompey would be politically ruined back in Rome. Furthermore, Pompey looked at his own men. His troops had just marched for miles through the darkness, fought a bloody amphibious assault, and cleared a massive dirt fortification. They were exhausted, dehydrating under the midday sun, and their formations were totally disorganized. Pompey knew that if his tired men flooded into Caesar's abandoned tents, they would immediately stop fighting and start looting the gold, the wine, and the baggage. He was terrified that while his men were distracted stealing Caesar's silverware, Caesar's legendary veterans would find their footing, turn around, and launch a desperate, suicidal counterattack that could flip the entire battle. So Pompey blinked. He decided that a safe, orderly victory tomorrow was better than a risky, chaotic bloodbath today. He convinced himself that Caesar was completely trapped anyway, that his supply lines were dead, and that there was absolutely no rush to finish the job. He ordered his men to pitch their tents on the bloody field, pour some wine, and celebrate their massive defensive success. It was the single greatest strategic blunder in ancient history. Inside the suffocating, overcrowded left camp, Caesar didn't waste a single second of the miracle Pompey had just handed him. He didn't sit in his tent and weep. Instead, he immediately weaponized his men's survival instinct, turning their psychological trauma into a lethal weapon. Caesar called a mandatory emergency assembly of his entire army right there in the dirt. The soldiers gathered, expecting their commander to be furious, expecting him to order a decimation. The brutal Roman punishment where every 10th man is beaten to death by his comrades for cowardice. They stood in silence, hanging their heads in absolute shame, covered in the blood of the morning. But Caesar, the master psychologist, did something completely unexpected. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten them. He spoke to them with an eerie, calm, peer-to-peer directness. He told them that they shouldn't blame themselves for the retreat. He reminded them that they had conquered the fiercest barbarians in Europe together, and that a single bad day in the mud couldn't erase a decade of loyalty. He told them that their defeat wasn't because the enemy was better, but because of a freak accident of geography and a minor logistical oversight. And then he turned the knife. He looked his hardened veterans dead in the eye and said, "If you want your honor back, you have to earn it. I'm not angry at you. I'm disappointed that you let Pompey think he is better than you." The psychological effect was instant and devastating. The soldiers didn't feel relief. They felt an intense, burning wave of collective humiliation. Plutarch records that the men began openly weeping, beating their own chests, and screaming at their officers to lead them back out onto the field. Grunt soldiers were begging to be punished, demanding that Caesar put them on the front lines of the next battle so they could wash away their disgrace in enemy blood. Caesar looked at his roaring, fanatical army and smiled. He had successfully taken a broken, terrified mob and transformed them back into a pack of starving wolves. But Caesar also knew that the clock was ticking. Pompey's army was still massive, well-fed, and sitting right outside the gates. If he stayed in this camp until morning, Pompey would inevitably realize his mistake, bring up his heavy siege engines, and starve them out. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the Albanian cliffs, Caesar gave his most dangerous command of the day. He ordered his men to extinguish every single campfire in the camp. They were to leave their heavy baggage, their expensive tents, and their wounded pack animals behind. In total dead silence, under the cover of a pitch-black, moonless night, Caesar's army began to slip out of the rear gate of the camp, one by one, marching down into a steep, dangerous ravine. They were abandoning the wall they had bled for months to build, packing up their weapons, and disappearing into the mountains of Thessaly. When Pompey's lookouts finally woke up at dawn and looked across the field, Caesar's camp was a ghost town. The wild beast had escaped the cage, and the final, apocalyptic showdown at Pharsalus was officially locked in. The philosophy of the brink. The midnight march through the ravines of Epirus was not a glorious military parade. It was a desperate, silent crawl through a pitch-black labyrinth of rock and mud. Julius Caesar's army was moving with the frantic, calculated speed of a predator that had barely chewed its way out of the steel trap. The soldiers marched in absolute, eerie silence. No singing, no talking, no clanking of armor. They left their campfires burning behind them to trick Pompey's lookouts, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of tents, personal baggage, and the rotting carcasses of their dead horses. Every man carried nothing but his weapons, his armor, and the heavy, burning weight of his own public humiliation. Caesar rode at the head of the column, his signature bright red general's cloak folded away in the dark. This night walk into the mountains of Thessaly marks a profound, permanent shift in Caesar's strategic philosophy. Before the disaster at Dyrrhachium, Caesar had operated on an almost mystical belief in his own personal destiny. He was a man who truly believed that his fortuna, his legendary luck, would physically bend reality to accommodate his genius. He had crossed the Rubicon on a gamble. He had landed in Albania on a gamble. But as he looked back at the smoking, dark outline of the 15-mile wall his men had spent months bleeding to build, Caesar realized a cold, brutal truth that would define the rest of his life. Luck is an unstable foundation for an empire. To understand the sheer magnitude of the strategic pivot Caesar was executing on this march, you have to look at the geographical board. By fleeing inland toward the fertile plains of Thessaly, Caesar was intentionally cutting himself off from his primary naval support and his original base of operations on the coast. He was marching blindly into the heartland of Greece, surrounded by hostile territory, with an exhausted, starving army. If Pompey chose to simply follow him at a distance, refuse to fight, and use his massive fleet to block any further supplies, Caesar's legions would eventually run out of arrows, lose their boots, and starve to death in the mountains without Pompey ever having to swing a single sword. But Caesar wasn't playing a military game anymore. He was playing a psychological one. He knew his opponent better than Pompey knew himself. Caesar understood that by retreating, He was dangling the ultimate psychological bait in front of Pompey's arrogant Senate entourage. The moment Pompey's scouts realized Caesar's camp was completely empty at dawn, a wave of ecstatic, manic celebration swept through the aristocratic ranks. The senators didn't see a tactical retreat. They saw a broken, cowardly fugitive running for his life. The ancient writer Appian notes that Pompey's command tent immediately devolved into a circus of absolute hubris. The wealthy politicians began packing up their luxury travel gear, shouting that the war was over and demanding that Pompey march the army inland at double time to hunt down Caesar like a wild animal. Pompey's veteran staff officers pleaded with him to be cautious. They argued that there was no need to risk a pitched battle against Caesar's veteran infantry when they could simply starve them out over the next 2 months. They begged Pompey to use their superior numbers to slowly corner the rebel forces. But Pompey was trapped by his own success. The sheer weight of his aristocratic peers' expectations was crushing him. The younger senators began openly mocking him in the morning assemblies, whispering that he was intentionally keeping the army in the field because he was addicted to the power of supreme command and didn't want to return to civilian life. Domitius Ahenobarbus publicly labeled Pompey a coward, declaring that a real Roman general would have wiped Caesar off the face of the earth days ago. This toxic peer pressure is exactly what Caesar was counting on. He was intentionally creating a vacuum of power, pulling Pompey away from his ships, away from his clean supply lines, and forcing him into a terrain where raw, unadulterated infantry violence would decide the fate of the world. Caesar was translating his tactical defeat at Dyrrhachium into a psychological trap that would culminate just a few weeks later on the plains of Pharsalus. As the column of Caesar's legions finally descended from the rocky mountain passes into the wide-open fields of Thessaly, the physical transformation of the army was nothing short of miraculous. The desperation of the coast was gone. The soldiers were foraging through wealthy, untouched Greek towns, filling their grain bags, drinking clean river water, and replacing their broken leather armor. But more importantly, the psychological conditioning Caesar had applied to them after the rout was starting to curdle into something truly terrifying. The regular legionaries had developed a collective, fanatical obsession with redemption. Grunt soldiers were refusing their daily rations, demanding that their officers give them double guard shifts to prove their worth. The centurions were spending their rest hours aggressively drilling their lines in the dirt, sharpening their short swords until they were razor thin, and swearing oaths to the gods that they would never drop a legionary standard again. The entire army had been stripped of its complacency. They were no longer an army of conquest. They were an army of absolute survival, operating with the terrifying solidarity of men who had seen the bottom of the abyss and had nothing left to lose. This is the hidden legacy of Dyrrhachium that history books completely gloss over. They treat the Battle of Pharsalus as a sudden, isolated stroke of genius. But the reality is that the fierce, unstoppable ferocity Caesar's men displayed at Pharsalus was forged entirely in the humiliation of their border collapse. Dyrrhachium was the painful, bloody crucible that burned away the last remnants of arrogance from Caesar's high command. It forced a legendary dictator to look his own mortality in the face, to restructure his relationship with his men, and to realize that absolute power isn't maintained by marble walls or massive fortifications. It is maintained by the unyielding, psychological capture of the human beings holding the swords. The 15-mile wall on the coast of Albania was left to rot, eventually swallowed up by the coastal mud and tides, a silent monument to the closest Gaius Julius Caesar ever came to total destruction. The lines were drawn, the pieces were set, and because an arrogant Senate couldn't control their own hubris, Pompey the Great was officially marching his massive army straight into the lethal trap Caesar had spent the last 2 weeks preparing in the dark. The disaster at Dyrrhachium exposes the ultimate paradox of absolute power. The most dangerous vulnerability an empire-defining leader can possess isn't a shortage of soldiers, a lack of funding, or a broken supply line. It is the illusion of their own structural invincibility. Julius Caesar built a flawless 15-mile cage of dirt, but because his absolute arrogance convinced him that his authority was untouchable, he allowed a single unfinished wall at the edge of the sea to nearly erase his entire legacy from the fabric of human history. But the true genius of Caesar didn't lie in his ability to avoid disaster. It lay in his unmatched understanding of human psychology. Where a traditional Roman general saw a humiliating, catastrophic military defeat, Caesar saw a profound opportunity to reset his relationship with his men by weaponizing their collective shame, stripping away his own hubris, and deliberately luring an arrogant, politically fractured enemy into the mountains. Caesar turned a fatal logistical nightmare into the exact psychological catalyst that would win him the Western world. If you want to understand how this brutal lesson in the mud altered Caesar's strategic DNA and how it directly set the stage for the most calculated, high-stakes tactical gamble in ancient history, you cannot miss our next deep dive. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below. If Pompey had pressed the attack into the left camp at noon, would the Roman Republic have survived, or was the collapse of the system already inevitable? Thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next front line of history.